Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Sony 24-70mm F2.8 G Master Mark II lens. Sony's GM or Gold Master lenses are in their second generation, and the 24-70mm F2.8 to me is evidence of just how far Sony has come in the past 6 years. Originally, the premise of the GM series was that they were essentially future-proof, but I think that Sony really couldn't have predicted how that new technologies were going to enable them to make a lens like this that is smaller, lighter, more feature-rich, faster focusing, and optically superior. Of course, the flip side is it's also more expensive at about $2,300, but you can't have everything. But the new 24-70mm f2.8, as we will see in this particular review, is going to highlight how that this lens really has become the gold standard for standard zooms. So the question is, for you, is it worth the money? Well, hopefully we'll be able to help answer that question for you right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by Merak, maker of the Q1S Bluetooth-enabled magnetic rower. Space in my exercise room is limited, so I need equipment with a small footprint. The Q1S fits the bill and is easy to store upright where it takes only 20 by 21 inches of space. The built-in wheelbase makes it easy to roll back into place for a workout. The Q1S is made of quality parts and can support rowers up to 350 pounds. I've been pleasantly surprised by the quality of the rowing action. As the seat moves smoothly on the dual rails, the rower flywheel is very quiet, and the magnetic resistance is smooth over the 16 selectable levels. There is a basic LCD screen on board, but the rower is Bluetooth enabled and allows you to sync up with either the premium Kino Map or free Merak apps. The Q1S has been just what I've personally wanted in my weight room for years. Use the Amazon link in the description below for a discounted price on the Merak Q1S magnetic rower.
So as noted, this is the smallest and lightest 24-70mm f2.8 lens on the Sony platform. It weighs in at only 695 grams, or about 1.5 pounds. That's about 150 grams less than the Sigma and even more than what we saw on the original Sony 24-70mm G Master. Importantly to me also is the fact that this lens is considerably shorter. It comes in at about 120 millimeters, which makes it somewhere around 18 millimeters shorter. And what that means is that not only is the lens lighter, but the weight is much better distributed. One of the things that I kind of highlighted in my review of the original 24-70mm is that while Sony's bodies were smaller than DSLR bodies, that lens was actually a little bit larger than what the 24-70mm lenses I was accustomed to. And as a byproduct, the balance really wasn't all that great. With this new 24-70mm f2.8, the balance feels really good. And I also noted that the weight is distributed in such a way that even when I was using it on a gimbal and I wanted to zoom in a little bit, I found that I didn't have to do any kind of rebalancing, but it retained a nice balance there. And so it is a really nice lens to use in the field because of that. The diameter here is right under 88 millimeters. It's about 3.5 inches in diameter and has an 82 millimeter front filter thread. Now, as noted, this is a more feature-rich lens than its predecessor, and so one of the main areas that's been added, which is only a very new trend for Sony to include on the zooms, is the inclusion of an actual aperture ring. And not just an aperture ring, you have the ability to control it with 1/3 stop to tense. You have the ability to use a switch and to declick it, and so that you can do aperture racking. You also have the ability to put it just solely into automatic if you want to control it within the camera, and then, much like Sigma has been doing, there is an iris lock that allows you to lock it into either the automatic or the manual position, and that will keep you from inadvertently switching over into either one and possibly missing a shot as a byproduct. It's a nice little feature that is tucked in such a way that it's out of the way and thus is really not an issue at all. The same is true for the switch that allows you to click or declick. It's put in such a way to where it really doesn't take up real estate, and so things don't get busy and complicated out here, but it's there if you need it. It's not one of those things you're going to need all the time. And so I really like the way that Sony has put these less likely to be used often things. They're there, but they're not in the way. So a lot of control when it comes to aperture. And by the way, there are, instead of 9, there are now 11 aperture blades in the aperture iris. That really, as you can see, helps to keep a really nicely circular shape, both when you look into the iris and then also if you're looking at the specular highlights, the bokeh highlights, you can see that they stay nice and circular as the lens is stopped down. Now, a unique approach to the control of the zoom action here is that there is now a switch that allows you to control tension on the zoom ring. And so it's either the smooth position, and in the smooth position, it allows you to do just that fingertip type of zooming. And so you can zoom really fast, really easily, if you so desire. But there's also a tight option that allows you to zoom with a little bit more weight and damping on there. And one of the main things here is that I noted it eliminates the need for having any kind of a zoom lock. Even out hiking on multiple occasions, I had zero issues with zoom creep when I was in the tight position. And unlike an actual lock, it means that you can pull up the lens and you can take the shot and not have to worry about that extra step of having to unlock it. It's a really nice approach to control of the zoom here, and so I highly applaud that move there. Also upgraded here is that rather than just having one focus hold button near the AF/MF switch, you now have a secondary one. And so if you're shooting in a vertical position, you also have a focus hold button there, easy to hand. Just another little upgrade that's a part of the overall feature set. Beyond that, we also have a very thorough weather sealing. As you can see from this diagram, there are 14 different seal points internally. There's a fluorine coating on the front element. And so as a byproduct, you have a professional grade lens that is thoroughly sealed. Also improved here is the amount of magnification that you have. And so at your minimum focus distance, you can get a very high degree of magnification of 0.32 times. And that is obviously a really useful thing to allow you to, maybe as a wedding photographer or as a portrait photographer, to get in tight on some details, blur out some backgrounds, get some creative shots to augment your other work. It's just a useful feature to have. And so I'm really glad to see that. Now, one thing that isn't a part of the lens design is Sony's optical steady shot, or an in-lens stabilizer. They're going to rely on the in-camera stabilization, and obviously Sony is able to do that in large part because they have so readily adopted their in-body image stabilization, and it is widespread across the majority of their cameras. And for me, I didn't really notice the difference, and it does eliminate some optical complexity, or I should say mechanical complexity, to the lens, which means that there's just one thing less to go wrong there. And fortunately, Sony's optical steady shot in the camera is getting better and better all the time with each new camera release, and so it's pretty easy to rely on that. So overall, this lens was a delight to use. It is lighter, it is more feature rich, and just generally handles really, really well. It also is seriously upgraded when it comes to autofocus. Now there are a quad XD, which means extreme dynamic linear motors that are used as a part of the design. And so as you can see, focus changes are essentially instantaneous. You can go from close to a distant subject with no focus lag. It's just, once you try to focus, the focus group is there essentially. And so that means that on a camera like my Alpha 1 here, it not only can enable you to have the 30 frames per second, which any first-party Sony lens will, but it's also not going to slow you down, because if you have, where you're actually trying to prioritize actual focus and not just a burst rate, it's actually going to keep up with the action. And one thing that I really noticed is that probably the most frustrating shots I get is shots of Nala right now. She's young, and so as soon as she sees the camera, rather than running from it, she actually always starts to move towards it. And if you have a lens that doesn't focus really quickly, what you basically end up is a series of blurry shots where she has moved beyond focus every time. In this case, it actually nailed focus even as she got really, really close to the camera. And that was a byproduct of having such fast focus acquisition and the ability that when she starts to move to actually begin focus and to get it to the proper place. I also noted in this shot that autofocus was nailed right at the very edge of the frame. And I was reminded of how far we've come from the DSLR days when you just weren't going to take a shot off near the edge of the frame because there was no focus points out there. And even if they were, they tended to be much less sensitive and didn't focus as well. And so it is pretty amazing. We're very blessed these days to have such amazing autofocus systems both in the lens and in modern cameras. Now on the video front here for a moment, one thing that I did note that this lens seems to be pretty parfocal. And so as I zoomed in and out, I felt like focus stayed pretty consistent, and so that's interesting for video. Also with focus pulls, as you can see here, they are quiet, they're confident, they're smooth. I noticed an average amount of focus breathing there, so I tried with the breathing compensation, and frankly, I don't see a huge difference between the two clips. Maybe your mileage may vary on that, but I didn't find that to be any kind of extreme issue. The lens also did well with my hand test, no problem in confidently returning to focus on my eyes, and frankly, I would expect nothing different at this point. Sony's IAF technology is very, very good and very mature at this point. I also found that the lens worked well on a gimbal, and it was lightweight enough that I'm in the middle of also reviewing the DJI RS3 Mini. And even though that's a smaller gimbal, it was able to handle the combination of either my A7 IV or Alpha 1 and this lens and have zero issues, as you can see from the shots. I also noted that in this clip where I'm kind of tracking Nala as she moves around, how good even at f2.8 the lens did at just staying locked on the eye with no visible steps. This is a fantastic autofocus system, and it's one of the main areas that sets this lens apart from cheaper alternatives. So let's talk image quality here. You can see from the MTF chart that we have got even better. If it was the master before, it's more the master now in this Mark II version. That center performance is near perfect, and you can see that even at the weakest point, off at the extreme edge of the frame, the image quality is still quite good. And one thing that we'll see in our breakdown that we'll dive into here is that it's a really consistent performance all across the zoom range. So let's take a look at that.
So let's start by taking a look at a couple of sequences that show off this particular zoom range. So here we have the same scene from the same spot at 24 millimeters and on the right at 70 millimeters. So obviously some versatility. It's not a huge zoom range, but it's enough to cover a lot of focal lengths. Second look here, 24 millimeters on the left, 70 millimeters on the right. And so you can see that there's a lot of various options for framing a shot inside that particular focal range. Now, as a first-party lens, this is obviously going to have very good profile support, and you can see that on the wide end it is needed. We have, at 24 millimeters, we do have some barrel distortion. Not a massive amount, but as we can see here, as far as the correction goes, you can see it doesn't necessarily correct totally perfectly with a manual correction, so there is a little bit, it's not linear, there's a little bit of a mustache-type pattern, not strong, but there is some there, and then also some vignette. So taking a quick look at the quantity of both these things, I have a +8 to correct for the distortion. Now, just to give you some perspective, with the Sigma 24 to 70 millimeter, to correct the barrel distortion at 24 millimeters, I had to be into the low 20s. And so this is significantly less in the distortion department. As far as the vignette, it's not a particularly strong amount, +51 to correct for the vignette. And so, that puts us a little over 2 stops or in the 2-stop range, but really that's not bad for the wide end of a zoom lens like this. Now here's a look at what you get with the actual profile correction. So as you can see, it's a much more linear correction here. It takes care of that mustache pattern. And so fortunately, this is what you're going to see with either a JPEG or video file, and then using a correction profile in your editing software, you should end up with raw files, end up with an end result that looks more like this. So as you zoom throughout, first of all, you get to a neutral point, and then as you get towards the telephoto end, you can see that we move towards some pincushion distortion. A pincushion distortion is much more linear, so you can see that it was easier to correct for, and vignette is there, but not particularly heavy. I used a -5 to correct for the pincushion distortion and a +46, so a little bit less vignette than what we saw on the telephoto end. And once again, you're going to see a nice clean result if you're using the standard correction profile that corrects the distortion well and the vignette in a very linear and easy fashion. So let's talk about chromatic aberrations. When it comes to longitudinal chromatic aberrations, we can see here that I don't see a lot of purple fringing before the plane of focus. I definitely do see some green fringing after the plane of focus. Nothing extreme here, but neither is it fully corrected either. Now, I saw very good results when it comes to lateral chromatic aberration control. And so here we can see, just using a real-world image, that in these branches towards the edge of the frame, this is without any kind of correction having taken place, you can see that there just isn't any fringing there along the sides of the frame. So certainly a very positive end result when it comes to lateral chromatic aberrations. So here is my chart that probably most of you are familiar with at this point. Again, I'm using the 50 megapixel Sony Alpha 1 for my test camera, and I am shooting here, or showing you the results at a 200% magnification. So in the center of the frame, a really fantastic result. That MTF chart showed near perfect results in the center of the frame, and that's exactly what we see. Very high contrast, very high detail. Also, this is a really strong mid-frame result. Great contrast, great detail there. And if we pop all the way down into the far corner, we can see that there is some drop off in the corner, but it is still quite good. We have a fairly consistent result here out towards the corner as well. Now stopping down to f4, we can see there is just a little bit of a contrast boost in the center of the frame. It looks really fantastic. Mid-frame is looking even better still, really great detail. Down into the corner, there is some uptick in contrast. We can see it's still not as bitingly sharp as it is elsewhere, but contrast has improved, and this is a very usable end result in the corner. You can stop down to f5.6 for just a little bit better end result. And at f8, I would argue there is even just a little bit more contrast. Though unfortunately, often when you stop down this far, you're not really making any gains elsewhere. If anything, you can be stepping back a little bit. Though I would say that the center and the mid frame also look pretty good here at f8. We'll pop over to the other side and take a peek there as well. And it all looks quite good. And so if you want maybe your maximum performance at 24 millimeters, f8 gives you good consistent results across the frame. Now, our minimum aperture is f22, but as per usual on a high-resolution body, moving past f11 starts to give you diminishing returns, where diffraction starts to make the image look softer. So here's wide open on the left side and minimum aperture on the right side, and you can see how much better the wide open result looks compared to the minimum aperture result. Everywhere you look across the frame, the corners are probably the least extreme because that's where it was weakest to begin with, but you can see that f2.8 is definitely sharper than f22. Now, it is not unusual for zooms like this, particularly these standard zooms, to be maybe optimized on the wide end and then to drop off at other places in the zoom range. That's really not the case here. So we can see that at 35 millimeters, the lens, if anything, is sharper and even more contrasty. And that's true whether you're looking in the center of the frame. Here you can see it's better in the mid frame. And even down into the corners, you can see that it is a sharper end result. If we pop over and look at the other side, we can see there's just more contrast and detail there. So 35 millimeters is an improvement on 24 millimeters. So then if we compare 35 millimeters to 50 millimeters, we can see that while 50 millimeters is just very mildly behind the 35 millimeter performance, it is very, very close. And here in the mid-frame, I would say that it's probably every bit as good, if not a hair better, moving off towards the edge of the frame. And again, I would say that here in the corner, it looks every bit as good as what 35 millimeters did. Very close here in this part of the frame and over here as well. So, I mean, you're not talking about any kind of real regression there, even moving on to 50 millimeters. So then if we move on to the crucial 70 millimeters, we can see compared to what we just saw at 50 millimeters that the center result looks very similar. I would say ever so slightly less contrast. And the mid frame is very, very close, very strong detail once again. And off into the corner, a very, very similar end result. Over on this side, we can see that I would say contrast is even slightly better at 70 millimeters. And off towards the edge of the frame, they're looking very, very close. And so, I mean, this is very consistent performance all across the frame. In this zone, I would take the 70 millimeter result over what I saw at 50 millimeters. And so just really, really great consistency across the zoom range. Just to give you a little bit of real-world context of that performance at 70 millimeters. So here's a shot at f5.6. I was down low using the high snowbank and the light here to give you a look at just some nice, simple contrast in lines. But just look at at 100% magnification. This is shot on the A7 IV. You can just see, though, that the detail is just flawless there on that. It looks really, really great. Here's a shot also on the A7 IV of Ferrari. This is wide open, f2.8 at 70 millimeters. And you can see the detail there is really, really impressive, just delineating all of that fur. You can see here looking at the whiskers, very little chromatic aberration. And also taking a look at the defocused area, it looks quite nice. Here's a pair of shots, one taken at f2.8. This is at f5.6. Almost the same focal length in the middle of the zoom range there. And you can see that at 100% magnification, frankly, it's not all that easy to tell the difference between f2.8 and f5.6. I mean, there's going to be some difference in the depth of field, but you can see you're getting tons of punch out of the lens, even wide open at f2.8. Here's a shot of the same scene, this taken at 50 millimeters, and you can see as we zoom into a pixel level, I mean, the detail is fantastic. I mean, this, Sony is touting that this is offering up prime type image quality, and while, that's obviously prime's going to give you much larger maximum aperture to work with, as far as just the raw detail at f2.8, this very much is very similar to a performance that most primes would give you at f2.8. Now, there seems to be a little bit of confusion out there as to how to achieve the maximum magnification figure of 0.33 times. I've read it reported by several that that's actually achieved at the 24 millimeter end. That doesn't actually seem to be the case. And so here we can see that at 70 millimeters, first of all, we'll take a quick look at the detail, which is nice. It performs well up close. But here's our degree of magnification at 70 millimeters if I manually focus and use the minimum focus distance. And at 24 millimeters, you can see that it's not nearly as high of a magnification figure, even if you can get a little bit closer. And so as a byproduct, I don't think the reporting that says that the maximum magnification figure of 0.33 times is taken at 24 millimeters. That's not high enough magnification, but this 70 millimeter performance is. And so that's where our maximum magnification is actually at 70 millimeters. And frankly, I like that much better. It's much easier to access that with a little bit longer working distance than trying to get right on top of something at the wide end. Quick look at the bokeh geometry here. We can see that there is a very slight amount of fringing along the outside of the bokeh circles, but you can see that geometry is fairly good, fairly circular. It's, getting squeezed a little bit here, but still closer to a circle shape than at f4. Pretty consistent circles everywhere. f5.6, still very circular. There's a little bit of motion blur here because it was quite dark where I was shooting this, but you can see as far as the geometry, it looks quite good. Overall, I would say the quality of the bokeh is quite good for a standard zoom, and so you can see in this case quite creamy in the foreground, and then we're going down towards a detail there and blending away again. Here also, detail is really quite nice, as you can see here up close, and you can see that it blurs away very nicely. And another shot here where you can see that chain at varying depths of field, it blurs away quite nicely. This shot stood out to me as really showing very nice creamy bokeh, and so nice detail on our subject here. This is a handheld shot, but you can see that in these varying degrees of defocus, it is all falling away really nicely. One final thing to look at is flare resistance. Flare resistance is not perfect. You can see that there is some ghosting artifacts here, wide open at f2.8. Stopping down to f11, you can see that the ghosting pattern becomes a little bit more pronounced. You can also see a nice 22-bladed sun star that comes from the 11-bladed aperture. I can also point out that either wide open or stop down, there's not a problem with veiling. Contrast is holding up really nice, but there is a bit of that ghosting pattern to be aware of.
So as you can see, really very little but good to report when it comes to the optics. There's a lot of times that these camera companies talk about having prime image quality in their zooms. That's actually true here. Not in the sense of being able to have that huge maximum aperture, but in terms of having equivalent sharpness at f2.8, it is very close to a lot of prime lenses out there. In short, this is the best performing, most feature-rich standard zoom that I've ever tested, while also managing to be smaller and lighter than other 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8. That's a winning combination. It used to be that if you were to have optical improvements, it meant that you had a bigger and a heavier lens. But somehow Sony has managed to reverse that trend to where their newer lenses are smaller, and yet they are optically superior to what I've seen before. I love that trend because it means I'm far more likely to reach for a lens that is not so onerously heavy to bring along. There are some cheaper alternatives. The Sigma 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 Art is one of those. It does have more barrel distortion. It's not quite as sharp, and it's not quite as fast to autofocus. And I have heard a lot of anecdotal reports from those that have mentioned that they have gotten dust inside their copies, despite it claiming to be weather sealed. So this is superior in those regards, though it's about twice the money. Another good alternative if you can live with a slightly less wide focal length is the Tamron 28-75mm G2. I had a very, very good experience with that lens during my test. I was impressed by the build quality, the weather sealing on it, the autofocus performance, and the optics there. But again, 28 to 75 millimeters is not the same as 24 to 70 millimeters, and you're not going to get as amazing either autofocus performance or the ability to unlock the full burst speed if you're using one of Sony's sports cameras. So bottom line is that this lens is expensive at $2,300 US. But if you want the best, this is the lens to buy, particularly if your work includes demanding autofocus and you need to catch those critical shots, maybe at high speed. That might make this lens worth the investment, even with its high price tag. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find a linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery. There's some buying links there if you'd like to purchase, and beyond that, linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, or to get channel merchandise. And of course, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.